Sleepy Joe.
Sleepy Joe.
Donald Trump's idiotic statements.
The Donald Trump stupidity, right?
Sleepy, creepy, crazy Uncle Joe. Mumbling, barely there. Corrupt Joe Biden.
The corruption in the Trump presidency and
The corrupt, the confused. Bunker Joe Biden.
Scarier thing about him is that he is stupid.
Often, we feel like we're in the most divisive time in American history. Democrats point to the ineptitude of the Trump administration, while Republicans point towards the left's promotion of a cancel culture and self-righteousness. All of this propagated by echo chambers that make us feel a reconciliation or an honest debate is impossible. But we, at every detail considered, want to give a historical perspective and realize that all of this has a precedent. We have had divisive times almost continuously throughout history, often in the same manner as today. The same words, the same rhetoric, the same protests, the same pulpits. As we will see, history may not repeat itself, but the forces behind it do, and one of those is political media. To realize how divisive politics can be, let's look at one of those momentous political upheavals in modern history, the French Revolution. The French Revolution was the nationwide peasant uprising against the aristocrats and the monarchy. In the face of lower incomes and devastating famines, these revolutionaries spoke of freedom and liberty and building a republic inspired by the success of the American Revolution, replacing the French establishment. On the other side of the Atlantic, the spirit of the revolution was heavily debated. At the time, America had two parties, Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans and Alexander Hamilton's Federalists. The Democratic Republicans saw the revolution as the embodiment of liberty. The Federalists, however, saw the revolutionaries as demagogues, creating havoc with no end. Political media had its own opinions. The Democratic Republicans had National Gazette, and the Federalists had the Gazette of the United States. Here's the National Gazette during the early years of the French Revolution. It claims that every part of the nation celebrates the revolution in France, heralding it as one of the most splendid in history. Further below, we can see the words and phrases the National Gazette and the Democratic Republicans have associated with the revolution in France. They include those inspired by the American Revolution, such as the rights of man, we will be free, and liberty. We've separated this rhetoric into common rhetoric in yellow and repeated name-calling and labeling in blue, which we'll come back to later. Before we take a look at the Federalists' view of the revolution, let's consider why their opinion might differ by exploring some of the controversial events that stained the pure stance of the revolution. Notably, King Louis XVI was sentenced to death and guillotined by the ruling National Assembly. This was following the September massacres of 1792, in which from between 1,100 and 1,600 prisoners were killed under the at best indifference of Georges Danton, a leader of the National Assembly. A great majority of them were non-political, including women, children, and common criminals. Now let's take a look at the opposite end of the political spectrum. Here we have a Gazette of the United States paper supported by the Federalists, taking a completely different look at the revolution. Instead of speaking of the qualities of liberty, the newspaper highlights the violent, indiscriminate massacres and complete erosion of proper justice. Here's an account in which a plain French citizen deplores the guillotining of King Louis XVI as an infamous iniquity, and condemns the massacres of September. Note how the paper uses the view of a common person to impose the idea that it's an obvious opinion. However, the National Gazette and the Democratic Republicans have their own retort. In this paper, they ridicule the kings and priests as tyrants, claiming they're impious and stating that enlightened human reason should replace monarchies and religion. Their rhetoric is clearly equating villainy and tyranny, highlighted in blue to emphasize the consistent labeling, with kings and priests, the underlying argument being that removing the shackles of tyranny requires sacrifice for the greater good. One of Thomas Jefferson's most famous quotes on liberty is that the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Here are the Federalists' comment on how, although the French Revolution claimed to destruct despotism and secure equal rights, the prevalence of assassinations and murders have destroyed the country. They call the leaders of the National Assembly the foul fiends of anarchy and confusion. Clearly, while the Democratic Republicans view the bloodshed and disturbances as a necessary sacrifice, the Federalists focus on the despotism and anarchy that is consuming the nation. To top off our look at the French Revolution, let's see how the National Gazette views the anti-French Federalists. They begin by accounting how a certain party wishes to create sympathy for Louis XVI and deride the current revolutionary leaders. The paper goes on to claim that the party has disregarded truth, instead offering a mangled view. It goes on to defend the violence in France by first employing a euphemism, excesses, and then claiming that they're unavoidable. Finally, they write that whatever excesses have happened have been exaggerated, and the Federalists have been claiming crimes that haven't happened. From the highly divisive event of the French Revolution and the political media of the day, we can draw a few conclusions about how bias inevitably invades journalism. Namely, it is clearly possible that two ends of the political spectrum will look at two entirely different sides of the same coin, almost completely disregarding the others. The Federalists focus on anarchy and excessive violence and the lack of proper justice. The Democratic Republicans highlighted the need for equality and the destruction of tyranny brought about by the monarchy. In pursuit of these perspectives, both newspapers employed common rhetoric, the voice of a common man, and ridiculed the opposite side as liars and demagogues. Now let's move from the international sphere of history and discuss the most controversial period of our own, the Civil War. Looking back, we can obviously declare the institution of slavery as horrendous and the antithesis to the liberties and freedoms that the United States claims as its leading virtues. But at the time, specifically the decade or so leading up to the Civil War, this was far from a settled matter. Quite the opposite, with the vindictive and crude language associated with abolitionists and religious arguments supporting slavery. The vestiges of hate between the North and South still exist to some degree today, and this is the period that embittered them immensely, not in small part due to the opinions filtered and bolstered in the newspapers of the time. Let's begin with the Abbeville Banner, a newspaper based in the very pro-slavery state of South Carolina. As stated before, we're highlighting in blue repeated name-calling and political labeling. You'll find that abolitionists and Northerners are often called fanatics and demagogues in response to their policies. In response to slavery, the paper says that slavery is purely a Southern matter, that Northerners don't have the constitutional authority to legislate. Furthermore, they accuse the North of trying to create agitation and disloyalty between a slave and his master. It even gives a religious defense, claiming that slavery is not only not a sin, but is necessary to the well-being of a slave. Looking back, we might think it obvious that the federal government would have the ability to outlaw as awful of an institution as slavery. But what's important to keep in mind is that slavery had been a debated issue for decades, and the attitude had always been compromising, such as the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850, that essentially allows slavery to go on with just a few limitations. Failure of legislation like the Wilmot Proviso showed that even though slavery could be adjudicated, its abolition was never seriously considered. Based on this attitude, Southerners, and especially the ruling plantation class, found the abolitionist fervor as merely the work of fanatics and agitators who wished to create war. Before we move on to specific moments that define the era before the Civil War, let's take a northern look at slavery. This is the New York Tribune, an anti-slavery paper. It starts by listing reasons supporting the disowning of slavery, including the release of one's conscience from the hell of slavery. In blue, we've highlighted how the North calls itself the friendly North Star. Here again in blue, the New York Tribune unequivocally equates slavery with crime, calling it the greatest cowardice of all. Finally, the paper claims that the abolition of slavery would bring joy and terminate wrongs and miseries. One of the defining divisive episodes of the antebellum era was that of Bleeding Kansas. Kansas had recently become a territory belonging to the United States, and it ignited a race to populate either with pro-slavery citizens from Missouri or free soilers mostly from the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic. It was important for the future of slavery that the state was either pro-slavery or pro-abolition because it could tip the balance in the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. As thousands poured in, tensions were bound to rise. One expedient was Missouri Senator David Rice Atchison, who stoked pro-slavery belligerence, urging Missourians to use force to repel the abolitionists. When territorial elections were held in November of 1854, Missourians swarmed the polls and scared away pro-abolition voters under threats of violence, earning them the title of border ruffians, resulting in pro-slavery candidates to sweep the Kansas elections. With this controversial history explained, let's take a look at what newspapers of the time had to say. Here's the Richmond Enquirer, a steadfast pro-slavery paper. It claims that the immigration from the South into Kansas is both honorable and creditable, under the headline Good News from Kansas. Furthermore, it calls Northerners the familiar terms of fanatics and speculators, insinuating that Northerners only care about making money off the land. It goes on to describe immigrating Southerners as patriotic and union-loving, who are righteously outnumbering the destructive infidels that are the abolitionists. Lastly, the paper states that the Missourians coming into Kansas are dutifully looking for a land of promise where they can use their skills to settle, refuting the claim that they're immigrating only to sway territorial elections towards pro-slavery. Now we have a staunch abolitionist paper, the New York Times, and its view on the Kansas debacle. It immediately brings about the consideration that elections are of utmost importance, and specifically that only qualified voters should decide. It goes on to claim that the Missourians are an army, armed with Bowie knives, pistols, and rifles, who marched into Kansas to steal the election by threatening naysayers against voting. The paper then states that Missourians not only voted in Kansas as Missourians, but gloried in it and declared it as right and proper in the pursuit of making it a slave state. It states that free soilers kept away from the polls because of the threat of violence against them. And lastly, here's an example of the name calling that separates the argument. It's impossible to find a more divisive period in American history than the years leading up to the Civil War, and of course, the war itself. Whatever judgments may be passed today on the North and the South, it's beyond clear that definitive judgments couldn't be passed then. And even though the topic of slavery and states' rights are completely different than that of the French Revolution, it's obvious that the same tools of rhetoric, name-calling, and looking at two completely different sides of the same coin are the same methods that shape the political conversation and harden opinions in defiance of each other. As we move towards the modern era, we can see how political biases evolved to today. With the burgeoning technology of television came modern political media. In this early period, there existed only 3 channels: CBS, NBC, and ABC. You might expect that from the start, there would be political bias similar to which that we find today. But you'd be wrong. In 1949, the Federal Communications Commission established the Fairness Doctrine, a standard that required a reasonable balance of views on any issues put forth to the public. An amendment was made that required broadcasters to provide varying opinions, meaning that both Democratic and Republican views should be presented. Here is CBS Evening News, anchored by Walter Cronkite, an accomplished journalist who is often called the most trusted man in America. The story presented is that of a U.S. Supreme Court decision, in which the court said that cities need not keep integrated public services, such as pools, open after integration. Pay attention to the fact that both sides of the argument are presented, even though there is sympathy shown for African Americans.
Today's ruling has already been called a major setback for civil rights and for the urban poor. Jackson argued before this court that integrated pools would cause dangerous tensions, decreasing revenues and operation of the pools at a financial loss.
As you can see, the idea that the decision is a major setback is presented alongside the reasoning that also defends the decision, rather than merely attacking it like you would see in modern media. Of course, the main political event of the time was the release of the Pentagon Papers and their effect on the continuation of the Vietnam War.
Senator George McGovern, a leading critic of the war, called the report, and we quote, "a story of almost incredible deception of the Congress and of the American people by the highest officials of the government, including the President of the United States."
Although CBS is sympathetic to anti-war sentiments, they're also aware that there are more sides to their argument. Here, CBS gives a balanced interview to a Vietnam War advocate who only dislikes the secrecy of the papers, not the war itself.
Senator Barry Goldwater, the Republican presidential candidate in '64, who advocated bombing of the North, had some comments of his own on the document, and he talked with Marvin Campbell.
Had the American people been told by the president, or by the president and me, who was running against him, that the American people would have solidified behind the president, and President Johnson would not have had to quit the office.
From these broadcasts and many similar ones, it's clear that these programs weren't pushing a narrative or expounding their political views. Although there could definitely be a sympathy for a side, their rhetoric is far more reserved, the name-calling is entirely absent, and the divisiveness and echo chambers are a far degree less than today. However, as television progressed, there came discontent from the Republican camp that the media was still becoming too liberal, and that the Fairness Doctrine still worked against the GOP, highlighting university scientists and experts over political pundits and the common American. So the Reagan administration made the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine a priority, finally doing so in 1987. Now broadcasters had no obligation to present both sides of an issue, and the content was dictated not necessarily by truth and fairness, but by ratings and viewership. Keeping all we've gone over so far in mind, let's take a look at some articles today and see if we can recognize the same lines of rhetoric that we've taken note of in centuries past. We'll focus on the Paris Climate Agreement, which the US backed out from. Here's a negative outlook on exiting the agreement. The paper states that the US risks severe economic harm and loses its ability to influence other countries. It goes on to say that even conservatives agree with clean power and that taking action against climate change is the logical choice, going so far as to say that Trump is doing a disservice by exiting the agreement. This is the New York Times on the California wildfires and their impact on the climate. They state that climate experts are at a loss of words, saying that the fires are a direct result of and will continue to aggravate climate change. Now here's a response from Fox News. Here, they mock the Democrats' clamor about climate change with the same degree they mock systemic racism. Rather than listen to climate experts, they present the view of a common American and say that individuals can't be blamed, like the left do. They continue to ridicule the effort by sarcastically saying that voting for Donald Trump is the same as lighting a tire fire in your yard, demeaning the left. So next time you click to your favorite TV news channel or news site, keep in mind how the divisiveness and echo chambers you might encounter are the same types that have influenced people for centuries. If you feel as if you're living through a tumultuous time when you're not sure what to think, remember that countless people have been in your exact shoes. It's okay to have a difference in opinion, In fact, it's fundamental to democracy. We merely implore you to be vigilant, keep track of the rhetoric that you come across and may not even be aware of, make opinions knowingly, not just because others are telling you that they're right.